Advanced Power Automate Desktop. Today we will look at the best practices around exception handling, building a configuration file, subflows, data validation, work queues, and do real-time logging. I'm Jensen, a Microsoft most valuable professional, and let's start by building a sample flow, and then we will add all the advanced techniques to that. Today we are building one flow, and then we will apply all the best practices to that workflow. Go to Power Automate Desktop and then click New Flow. We will call the flow Best Practices Demo, and then we'll click Create. That will open up a blank workflow. I prepared a web page. It looked like this. This mimics one of the things that we can see as an RPA developer, probably what we see the most. This is a system that we want data to go into. So here we want the workflow to do a student ID, a first name, a last name, and then you want to click Add Student. Here you can see the student successfully got added, and we can see the student down here in the table. But we can also produce errors. Let's say that we have a student ID of an invalid format like this. Try to add this. You can see it will not get added and it produces an error message. This is one of the things we want our workflow to handle, but we also want to do logging, configuration, queues. We want to do the whole package. We need to build the perfect flow, so stay tuned. First, we will download some Excel sample data. Go up here and click Download. That will take you to a Google Sheet. Go into File, say Download, and choose Microsoft Excel like this. That will download it. Let me open up the folder here. Let me minimize everything, and then we move it to our desktop like this. I can also close this. We'll create a folder for our project so we have everything in one place. Keep in mind that we do it here on the desktop. Normally, when we develop, it's fine to use the desktop, but we won't use the desktop to store project files when we move them into production. In that case, we will move them to, for example, the network drive where several people have access to them. Here I'll say New Folder. I will say Project. I'll move my students into that. And now this will be the working folder today. Let us open it. Let's also open the student XLSX. I will drag it in here from my second screen. And here you can see that we have 4 sheets. The first sheet we will work on is the students tree. Here we have 3 students. So what we want here is to fill in these 3 guys here, or women, into our system. At first, these are 3 successes. We will not be getting any errors. So that is the basic flow that we want to build. When we have built that, we will start adding best practices to the workflow one by one. So here we want to go into the students tree, and let me close this. I also want to grab the project path here, that is this folder. So what you do here, and that is important, click Shift on your keyboard, and then when you right click, you will see a copy as path. You will not see it if you don't click Shift. So you need to click Shift, hold it down, and then right click. Choose copy as path. Then we can go back to our Power Automate desktop flow. So here we have the blank flow. Let's use a region. Regions are great to clean up our flows. It looks like this. I drag in a region. We will give it a name. Let's start by having the initialization. It's always hard to spell for me, but this should do it. I'll click Save. A region will be ignored at runtime, the region itself, but everything in will be performed. So it's an excellent way of keeping track of your different groups of actions, and I'll definitely recommend you to use it. Let's use a variable in here. So I'll go up here and then I'll find a set variable. I'll drag that in here. We will give it a name, and I will call it project path, and then I will Control V, paste in the path to the project folder, delete the quotation marks, and regarding variable naming, you can see here that the project path, we use the Pascal naming convention. That's the default that Microsoft uses here in Power Automate Desktop, and it's also the one that I will recommend you to use. That means that we start every variable with a capital letter, and each new word in that variable name we will start with a capital letter too. So here we have the project path, P and P are capitalized. That's it. Let's click Save here. We also put in all the variables where we have data in that can change. Imagine that I move this workflow to either a different folder when I finish developing it, or I move it to a colleague's computer. Then it's easy to have the set variable in the beginning, right here. My colleague or myself just need to open this and change this path, then everything will work. So what we also need to do, I will also be sure to have an active Excel sheet variable so we can define which Excel sheet we want to read from. That's another best practice. We will do that because otherwise Power Automate Desktop will just open up the last used. So first we will launch it. I'll find a launch Excel and I'll drag that in here. That will go into the initialization. We'll read the data into a data table, and then we will work with it later on. Here we want to open up the following document. What do we want to open? Well, I've stored the project path in the project path variable. So I simply just click this X here and choose the project path. That's another important one. I really want you to use these variable pickers out here to the right instead of just writing in yourself. In that way, we make less mistakes. Then we want to say, I want to open up the student's book. So that will be a backward slash, students, and then .xlsx. We will not make it visible. And if I scroll down, I can see that we produce a variable called Excel instance. That's great. I can click Save. Now I want to set the active Excel worksheet, but let's create a variable for that here in the beginning as well, so we can easily change that in the action. It goes like this. Here I'll find a set variable. I'll drag it in as the second. Then I go up here. I will call this one active Excel sheet. And since we're going to start with the students tree, we're going to give that as a value. Then I can click Save. Now I can use the set active Excel worksheet down here right after the launch. Here I'm going into the Excel instance. I want to activate the worksheet with the name students tree, and that value I saved in a variable. Then that one will also be very easy to change once we will use different sheets. So here I'll take the active Excel sheet. And this is important to use the set active Excel worksheet, otherwise your Power Automate Desktop flow will just read the last Excel sheet opened or activated. Then I can click Save. Now we can read from it. So we specified the sheet that we want. I'll find a read from Excel worksheet, and then I'll drag it in here. What do I want to use? The value of a single cell? No, I want to use all available values from worksheet. Then I go into advanced. Our data got a headers column or headers row, so I will have it this one ticked. First line of range contains column names. Then the variables produced is called Excel data. Here we often want to use a name that describes the data within. Imagine that we even have more sheets written in our flow, then it will be very important. We will not have that today, but let's call it Excel data students like this. Then we can click Save. We also want to close this Excel book again, otherwise Power Automate can and will lock it for further use. So I go up here, and then I'll find a region, and I'll drag in a region below this. This will be the end region, so we will call it end. Just find a close Excel. So I go up here, and then I'll find a close Excel and drag it into the end. We will not choose to save this Excel book for now, but we'll definitely do it later. Then we can click save. Now try to run your automation by clicking run here, and again the regions themselves will get ignored at runtime. It's just a way to systemize your workflow. And one thing that we can do is, you can even see we can do this, then it's much cleaner to look at. We have 5 actions here and 1 action here. Once you have run your workflow, I can try to run it again. I just did, but if you didn't, please pick run. Then it will run. And what you need to see over here in the Excel data students, in case you don't see these variables to the right, just click this X here, go down here, double click the 3 rows, 4 columns. That will open up our data set. It looks fine. The Excel data students is what we're going to need to process our data. So I can click close. We also need to go to a web page, and that was this web page we saw in the beginning. So grab the URL up here, Control C, go back to Power Automate Desktop. We will open up the initialization, drag in another set variable that will store our URL. Let's drag it here. I'll call this one URL, and I'll Control V, paste in our URL. So here, sometimes when the name URL, you will always see that written in with capital letters, then we will differ from the Pascal notation and then simply just write URL with capital letters. But should we follow the Pascal strictly, it will look like this. But again, you will always see a URL in capital letters. This will make it easier to read and understand what's going on. Then we'll click save. Now we also need to open up our browser. So we can open it up here in initialization. It doesn't matter really where, but I will find a launch new. Then I'll take a Microsoft Edge. I recommend you to use Edge or Chrome. Those ones are the most stable. I use a lot of Microsoft, so Edge is natural for me. Feel free to use Chrome or even Firefox. Just never go with Internet Explorer. That one is outdated and not secure. So I'll drag in this launch new Microsoft Edge. I can choose to have it. I prefer to have the Excel block in the same place, so I will not place it in between it. I'll either place it before or after. I can do it before. We need a URL. We just created a URL. For that, a variable here, that will be stored in here. I'll choose to maximize the browser once it runs. Nothing important for the workflow itself, but when we demo here, it's nice to see it on the whole screen. Here we will produce a variable called browser. I can click save. So now we're opening up our browser. I've also read the data. We can start to do the transactions here in our workflow, and one transaction is one student. Go up here, find another region, and drag in the region between the end region from the initialization and before the region end start here. This one here we can call transaction, I think, or process transaction. So transactions, that or process transactions, doesn't really matter. Pick names that will make it easy for you to understand, not like region 1, region 2, or region 3. That will make it hard to come back to. These names make sure that we can easily see what's going on when we come back. So in this transaction, we want a for each to iterate through our data. So I'll find a for each and drag it in here. Here I want to iterate through the Excel data students. So I go up here, pick the Excel data students, and again, this current item, that is a reference for each one of the data rows that we can refer to. Pick a name that says something about the data. We will have the current student and we'll click save. Now we can say, what are we going to do here? Well, we're going to input data on the web page and then press add student. Find a populate text field on web page and drag it inside the for each. Here we will have a UI element. So I click this drop down. Then I click add UI element. Here's my web page. I want to first have a first name. So I have my mouse hover this, it will turn red. Press Ctrl on your keyboard. We have now added the first UI element. What are we going to write into it? Well, we're going to write from the current student, that is a data row. So I click this X, current student. Then I go in here and then I will give the header of the data table, that column. Or I can also give the index, but I prefer to give out the header. It will look like this. And again, if I need to show you where that comes from, you can see student ID, save. If I go into the current student, once we have run this once, you will see the data row here. And at first, it comes from this header. So each one of these rows also have these headers. So we can use the student ID, first name and last name. Let's have two more populate text field on web page. So I'll drag one more down. Add UI element, and then I'll pick the last name. I can move this, or first name, sorry, so you can see what's going on. And again, I can write it in. So I just say current student. I go up here and then I'll have a hard bracket and then first name, as that is the column header. First name. And similarly, we do the last name. So we create a new UI element, add UI element. And this one is rather quick because this is just a basic flow. I know I introduced some best practices, but once we proceed with this lesson, it will get very advanced and I will of course slow down. So here I'll say current student, then I'll say hard bracket, I'll say last name like this, and a hard bracket end. And again, you could also use the index of the columns. That is 0 index. That means that the student ID, you could write in 0 here without the single quotation marks. The first name is 1 and the last name is 2. But I prefer to use the column names. Those ones are more stable and will more rarely change than the index. Imagine that a person adds in a column, then the index will not make sense anymore. We also want to click a button. So here I find a click link on web page and I'll drag it in here. Find the UI element. So that will be the add student. I click Control, add it. So now we have these three populate text fields where we'll put in the data and we'll click. One other best practice is that we use UI names that is describing. You can see here, we use here input text format AA123, input text first name, that one is better. To rename these, we go over to UI elements, that is this stack of paper over here, and here we can see it. Pick this input text format AA, right click, rename, and we can call this input text student ID. I can also, in the same format, let's rename this. This one was better, but since we are using this, I'll just write in first name. So right click, rename, and then give them better names like this. So now we're done. What we just need to do is to have a close web browser down here in the end, and then we can try test the basic flow. And here I will have a close web browser. Drag it in here in the end. Doesn't matter if it's before or after the close Excel. That will close it. So then I can click save. Try to run it now. And To do so, we click Run, and we're done with the basic flow once we see this works. So we are opening up a web page, and now we start to put in the student ID, first name, last name. You can see that we successfully added the first one, and it's visible down in the table below. And that one was the second one. And since we have 3 students, Karen Lee is the last one, we are done. We even closed the browser. So that was the basic flow. Let's apply some very advanced best practices to it. We want to do a simple log where we'll update the status. If I minimize here, I go into my project folder, into the students, and open that. If I go to the students tree, we can see that we have a status column. Let's update with a success message. And I know if we have an error right now, we will also just update with a success, because then it's very easy to do the error handling afterwards. So we're still in the students tree. And in case we want to make sure that it opens here, just save here, and then I close. Then we go back to Power Automate Desktop. So here, since we're going to write back, we need a helping variable. Right now, we're working in the data table called Excel Students. We want to write back to the Excel book. And let me just show you the Excel data students here. That one is 0 index. That means that the headers row, we don't even have an index for that. In the Excel book, in the Excel sheet, we have the index 1. And here, data table, the first row is index 0, whereas in the Excel, if we have headers, that was index 2, index 1, 2. You'll get used to it, but in the beginning, it will be a little bit difficult that you need to add 1 to it. And here, since we have headers, we want to say, when I write this one here, and I want to update the Excel sheet, I want to add 2 to it. So here it's 0, but in Excel, it's 2. We will use a set variable and introduce a helping variable. So drag that one in before the for each here. I will call that one row index. And again, we will start with the value 2. I try to repeat these things a lot. Then I make sure that you will remember it. If things goes too fast, simply just pause or rewind the video. Is designed for that. I also want to say, for each one of these iterations, I want to add 1 to it. So I drag in a set variable down here. I go up here and then I find a row index. I will add 1 to it. That one is easy. I just pick the variable picker again, say row index, then go inside the code block and say +1. That will add 1 to it. Then I can click save. Then I want to update the Excel for each one of these. So I go up here and then I'll find a write to Excel worksheet, and I'll drag that one in right after the click link on web page and before the set variable row index, where we add 1 to it. That is important, so please make sure it's placed here. What do I want to write? Well, let's just say that we don't have a particular error handling. We just need to know when it's processed, it's a success. Then we'll add the error handling afterward. The write mode, that will be the specified cell. That is fine. And what column do I need to update? And here we cannot use the headers. We need to either use index or a letter. I prefer a letter, since that's what we are used to in Excel. Column A, B, C, D. That was the 4th column. And then for the row, we're using the row index. So I click this X and I'll double click the row index. I'll click save. One thing that we can do here is to make sure that Excel is getting saved for each one of these iterations with an Excel save to Excel, and that will save it to the original sheet, or we can just choose to save it down here. And that in this way, if the workflow stops for some reason, if we haven't handled an error, then we will not reach the close Excel, because the workflow will terminate, and that could be a problem. We will see later in this lesson how we can handle for every error in the flow. Let's just have a save document here, and we'll click save. Again, let's try to run it. And we know that the browser works because we saw that, we even saw the Excel. So what we're going to see here is simply just that we can write this log after we have entered the Karen student. So that was the first one, that was Avery. Now we have Sean, and soon we will have Karen, and we can inspect the Excel book. First name, last name, add student, and then the browser will close. That's it. Let me minimize this. Go to the student sheet. There you go. We have now a success for each one of these. One thing that I also want to do right now, we are overwriting the original data. It's usually better to write to a new file. Let's also say that this robot runs over and over. We want to log these Excel statuses right now to a separate Excel book. So what I do here, I still want to log it to here. I can either add an output folder or simply just do it here. For now, we will do it here because that's easier when we often need to open these in the coming hour or so. So I go back here. So in the beginning, I want to get the current date and time. So I go up here and I'll find a get current date time. And I will drag it in here after the set variable. So I can get the current date and time, it's my system time zone, and I will store it in the current date time. That one is fine. I'll click save. To use this date time for a variable, a text variable, so I can use it in the file name and make it dynamic. That is, we can use the date time each time this workflow runs to create a file name. That one will be unique. We will not need to override it at any point. Let me show you. So I'll find a convert, then I'll have a convert date time to text. Drag it up here. Here I will take the current date time, have it here. I will not use the standard. I like to customize it myself, so I pick custom. And here I'll write 4Ys, that is the year. That is the same format you use in Excel if you're used to that. If you want to know more, just google.net custom date time format. There'll also be a link to this in the video description if you want to know more. Simply just write after me now. And this is to say I want the year, month, days, and then I want the hours in 24-hour format, so I can easily sort with it. Then I want the minutes and seconds. It will look like this. So very rather long. Feel free to, for example, make a hyphen between the day and the time. Then it's probably more easy to see what's going on. This one will be saved in a formatted date time variable. I can click save here. And now if I scroll down here into the closed browser, let me double click. Let's choose to save the document as. And now our project path comes in handy because it's nice that we have the project path in a variable so that when we use it multiple times, we will just use this variable. This means that if the project path changes again, we can just change the value of the project path in the beginning. So right now we say we want to save it in the project path. I also want to have a backward slash, and so far it looks like this, students.xlsx, but in front of the students we want to have the newly created formatted date time. I click this X here, double click the formatted date time, and after this percentage signs I'll have an underscore. That is just to separate these two names. So now I have dynamic file naming for my output. That means that if I click save here, we run it once more, then we're going to fill in these 3 students here. And once we have done that, we will have a dynamic file naming that will make sure that the file will never get overwritten. So again, here we can put in these 3 students. And one trick to speed it a little bit up, because we will try to run these flows a lot today. That is to go down to run delay and pick 1. This means that we will usually have a delay between each action in the workflow of 0.1 second. That will be a lot when we work with it. Instead, we now have close to nothing. We will only see this delay here in the editor. If you run your flows from either Power Automate Cloud, the overview, or desktop shortcut, we will also have a run delay of 1. It's nice sometimes when we build these to have these delays so we can see what's going on. So let me just click save here. That is another important thing. There's no autosave in Power Automate Desktop, so make sure you save your workflows. Power Automate Desktop will ask you to save once you quit. But let's say that our computer restarts by accident, then everything would have been lost. If I go back here, you can now see that we have a log or a date before our file naming. That means that each time I run this robot, we will be creating a new Excel book, and here you can see with the data. If I open up the original, I can also choose to delete this, click save, just to make sure that, say, this is the original. We will not update this at any time. Then I can close. Let's do some error handling. We can divide these errors in categories. First, we have the success, that is no error. Then we can have a business exception. That will be when we have something wrong with our data. That could be a missing student ID or a student ID in an invalid format, but of course also first and last name. Today we will only work with the student IDs, but you can apply the techniques on each one of these categories of data, first name, last name, or even each category of your own data. Just your fantasy sets the limit. And what we want to do in a real life scenario is to handle every exception that can occur. And finally, we also have a system exception. That means that if a web page or a system is completely down, or maybe just the button is missing or an input field is missing, something that our workflow cannot handle, we also want our workflow to handle that. Let's start by the business exceptions. That was errors in the data. And let's see what we can do for that. So let me go to the input data again. Here I want to move to the students exceptions here, and I can choose to right click, rename, Control C just to copy the name out because I'm lazy and don't want to make errors. This is the sheet that we're working in now. And here you can see Daniel Chen got a blank student ID. We shouldn't process that, but we want to log that here is a business exception. And similarly down here with Peter Liu, we can see that we're missing a digit in his student ID. So let me just close this and go back to Power Automate Desktop. So right now we will be working in the students exceptions. So if I go up here in the set variable active Excel sheet, I just double click, Control V, and there you go. We have now said we're working in a different sheet. It's that easy. So that's why I always keep my variables in the beginning. They're easy to change there. It's especially productive if we're using the variable more than once in our workflow. That's why it's a best practice to use variables, because that way we can just change it up here and it will automatically be updated further down the flow multiple times. Let's structure this flow a little bit better. As you can see, we already have a lot of actions. In fact, we're using 26 lines of code. Of course, some of them are regions and stuff, but we can structure this a lot better. So go into the for each. Let's take the 3 populate text fields. So click this one with your mouse so it turns gray. Hold Shift in and then click the click link on web page. Now you should see that these 4 will be gray. Then you'll say Control X to cut them out and we will make a new subflow. A subflow is simply just a flow within this workflow that you can call from the main. This one is called main, and this is the flow that will always start when we start our workflow. So if you go up here, subflows, new subflow, and here we can call this process transaction, since this is the single one, and here was the transactions. So then I can click save. Here I simply just Control V, I paste it in. Right now we don't have a connection between main and process transaction, so I need to go out here, and then I need to say in the beginning of the for each I will run this process transaction. So I'll find a run subflow, and then I'll drag it in here. Then in this dropdown you can find your process transaction, and then you will click save. Now we're going to handle the business exceptions, and yes, it is only the errors in data we want to handle, and later on we will handle the system exceptions as well. So here in the beginning of the for each, let's start by having the student ID as a variable. We can choose to have it as a student ID instead of the current student ID, since we're going to use it a lot. This is not necessary, but let me show you what we're doing here. So here I have the set variable. I'll just choose to, for understanding of this lesson, you don't have to do it, but it won't hurt you. So here I'll have the current student ID. That was the same thing we did before. So here I'm just saying that I want to take this current student ID and to store it in a variable. Since we're going to use to work with it a lot, I like that. Now we can use this student ID. If I go to a process transaction and see I used it here, I can just use the variable. Again, not necessary, but it will make my life a little bit easier as a developer. Then I can click save. We're now using the student ID here. Back to the main. We are also going to create a status variable and a status message. Here we will hold if we have a success or an exception, and we'll also have a log message saying what went wrong, in this case our data, afterwards the system. So drag in a set variable after the student ID, go up here, call this status. We're going to make this blank. So for each iteration, that is for each student, that we want to have a blank value once we start, we'll do that by having a percentage signs, then 2 double quotation marks, and then a percentage sign. That will be a blank value in Power Automate Desktop. Then we can click save. Similarly, we will have a status message. Because I'm lazy, click this set variable status so it turns gray. Control C, Control V, now we have 2 of them. Then I can just double click this one and change this name to status message. So now we are ready. So each time we go in here, we are creating 3 variables where we only needed to create these 2. This one was for simplicity in the flow. We'll see that in a little while. And then we are running the process transaction. But before we run the process transaction, I want to do data check to check if the data is correct. And that is even before we start processing data. Let's create a new subflow for that. So I go up here, new subflow. Let's call this data check. I'll click save. That will be blank. So the first one we're going to ask here, that is the student ID blank? Then we know that we shouldn't process it because it will give us an error in the system. So if I go up here, then I'll find an if. An if asks a question that could be answered true or false. Here I want to look at the student ID. So I find it here. And I want to say, is this student ID empty? So I find the operator empty. That will remove the second operand because there's no need for that. So here we are asking, is this student ID empty? Then I want to update my status message saying student ID is blank. Oh, now I put in student ID here up here. I'll have a set variable and drag it in here. Here we will use the status message down here. And here we will have the status message if this is true, and that is if it's empty. So I simply just say student ID is blank, and then a dot, and I'll click save. So once we have done that check, and let me just show you this input Excel data. Once we have done that check, that is this one here, then we can check if the student ID is in the correct format. And that is, we want 2 letters, a hyphen, and then 3 digits. And to do so, I'll go to my browser, go to regex 101, and here a test string. So we know that the correct format is this. We also have other sorts of formats that could be this. We can have a BC456, that will be another correct one. Then we'll have a DEF789, that will be 1 letter too much, and we can also have a number too much. This is just to test what we're going to do now, because now we're going to introduce regular expressions. That is one of the things that I want to recommend to learn as an RPA developer, because you will use it a lot. Regex is a series of characters that defines a search pattern. And that means we can define a search pattern that only find valid student IDs, and then we will use that in our flow. So what I will do here is that I will say, I want a letter from A to Z. That one is here. Here you can see this is 1 letter, A to Z. We will have a lot of matches. We'll have the N, the M, the A, B, C. Then I'll say, I want 2 letters after each other. I'll do it by having the curly brackets. Now you can see we excluded this. So here we have a match, here, here, here. Then we want a hyphen like this. I also want 3 digits. So I'll have a backward slash, the digits, the curly brackets 3, and this one here. So what we have now, here you can see we have 3 matches. You can even see them out here. And this is the regex 101 is a great regex tester, because it's also provide you with explanations. So right now we have 3 matches, and it even matches one of the things that we don't want to, because here it says, well, I found 2 letters and 3 digits here. We don't want that, so we want to say only if it's the start of the line. So if I go up here and make a hat, we now have our regex pattern where we can check if this is a valid format. We will use this. You can choose to be even more specific if you want to check for more errors, but let's stop here and say this is sufficient. I'll go back here, and then I know that if I'm in here, if this is empty, well, then I set the status message as student ID. But if it's not empty, then I can do some data check on it, which I will use with regex. Sorry, I'll have an else. I'll drag in the else here, and what I'm going to do is to find a parse text and drag it in here. What text do I want to parse? I want to parse the student ID. So I click this one here and double click the student ID. What text do I need to find? And that will be the regex pattern. So I'll Control V that regex pattern in. Then I'm telling Power Automate Desktop, this is indeed a regular expression. What I then need to do, that is down here in variables produced, we produce 2 variables. We have the position, and that is if it finds a match, it will say in what position of that string is it in. We don't really need that, so untake that. But we have a match, and that is if we find a valid student ID in this student ID here, then the match will get stored in the match variable. That means that we can check afterwards if this match got a match inside it, then we know we have a valid student ID. If it doesn't got a match, then we know that the student ID is in invalid format. So then I can click save here. So now I can go here and say, if this match is empty, then I know the student ID is not in the correct format. So find an if and drag it in here. So what I'm going to do is simply just say the match, if that is empty, then I know I can set the status message and I can say, well, the student ID is not in the correct format. And then I know that if I end in here, I can say that if the match is empty, then the student ID is not in the correct format. So let's grab this variable up here, Control C, go down to end, place your mouse there, Control V, paste it in. Then I'll double click here. That is just because I'm lazy again. And here I'll say, and I can even use the student ID. Student ID is not in the correct format, and a dot. And now we'll just need to ask, if this status message got something in it, then we know an error occurred up here. So I'll go over and drag in another if in the end. And then I'll say, if the status message isn't empty, then I know something is wrong here. But before we do that, another best practice is to make comments. That is, for more difficult parts of your workflow, you want to make a comment. That could be this one up here. So find a comment. A comment is again ignored by runtime. And when you use a comment to describe something in your workflow, have it before the actual thing it's described. You probably know it from programming. And here we say checks if the student ID is in the valid format by using regex like this. And here, now you can see this comment in here. It will get ignored at runtime. So it's a nice way to document your flow. However, use it only for the complicated part that will give you or your colleague a hard time when you come back to this flow. Don't overuse it and start to document each action, because then it will get even more confusing. So right now we will have this status message isn't empty. Then we want to run a subflow called business exception, which we will build now. So you go up to the subflows, you will have a new subflow, and here we will have a business exception name. I'll click here. So in this subflow, we will have a variable called status where we will log that here's a business exception, and then we will pick the status message. Go into actions, find a set variable and drag it in here. I will be calling this one status. We already defined it. It was blank in the beginning of the for each. So I'll just say this. And here I'll say business exception like this. And then we will give in the status message here. So right now I can just click save here. So we can also add other things to the log like a date. We will not do that for now. So if I go back to the data check here, down here, if this isn't empty, that means that we have something in the status message. We will run the business exception subflow. So find a run subflow here and drag it in here. What subflow do we need to run? We will run the business exception like here, and we will click save. Now we have built a data check. We'll also set that if we have a business exception, we will run the business exception flow. And a subflow means that we run the subflow and then we will come back. We haven't run the subflow out here in the main, so let's do so. So here again, run subflow. We will do that before the process transaction. And that is because we want to check if the data is valid before we run it. So here we will run the data check. I'll click save. So when this data check comes back, we want to ask, is the status empty? If so, we want to make sure that we want to make sure that we only run the process transaction when the status is empty. And that is, we find an if. We will drag it in between the data check and the process transaction. And here I'll say, is the status, is that empty? If that is the case, you can run the process transaction right here. So then I'll drag it in here. I will also need to say that if we have ran this process transaction, that is, if we reach this state down here, I know we can have exceptions tied to these populate text fields, but let's forget about them for now and make sure you stick, because we'll also handle them in this extensive Power Automate desktop lesson. So go up here, and then you'll find a set variable, drag it down here, click the X, have the status, and now we can say, well, we got a success. We reach this state. Go back to main. So now we know that we can either have a business exception or a success. Also go into the write to Excel worksheet, because right now we're not going to write success anymore. We will write the status. So find the status here, and then we will click save. Now we're done. Let me also save it. Then we will kick it, and we will see that we can now handle business exceptions, and we can even handle different types of business exceptions. So we have one where we checked if it's blank. We also have in the valid format. We could of course also check first name, last names, and every other data thing. We can even make it more extensive for the student ID. For now, this is nice. Feel free to add more data checks or even apply it to your own flows. So now we're done. Let's go to our student sheet. So we have this one working. Now, there you go. We have now made an even more advanced log, and you can see 2 different error messages. Now we also want to handle system exceptions. That could be if we cannot perform an action, for example, the populate text field, because an element is missing. Let me close this one here, and I've created another sample page. This URL you will find in the description as well. So here you can see that we missed the input fields, but we're also missing the other ones. So let's say that our flow experienced a problem with the first input field. Of course, we could also do a check if these are present in the beginning, but let's keep it simple. Copy the URL up here. So Control-C and go back to your Power Automate desktop flow. Then in the set variable URL, change it to this new URL and then click save. So right now we have a problem with the first populate text field because we don't have the input field, and we want the robot to log that. Go to subflows and then click new subflow. We will call this system exception, and it will be similar to the business exception. So I go up to actions. I'll find a set variable, and here I'll say status, and just like before, I'll say business exception, and then we will put in the status message like this, and we will click save. So right now we have done nothing, but we will do the check here in the process transactions. So what we want to do, we want to say, if we have a problem up here in the student ID, then we want to handle it. And yes, again, we could make the check to check if these ones were present in the beginning, but see this as we had a temporary problem with this populate text field just for this line. So then I can click on error. On error means that what should happen when we occur an error. We can do a lot of things. Here I just want to log a message to the status message. So I go up to new rule, set variable, go into this X, status message, and here I'll just say couldn't populate the student ID input field. we will still be throwing an error. So we need to say, we're throwing an error here. That means that our workflow stops if we don't do nothing, but we will surround it with an on-error block. It looks like this. You can see that we now have an on-error. You can see this for this blue shield. What we want to do here is that we will find an on-block error, drag it in here in the beginning. We can give this a name. That will be catch process errors. So what are we going to do here? Here I want to do two things. First, I want to run the system exception. So I take this new rule. I'll run the subflow, which is called system exception. But I also want to say we don't want to throw an error now. Now we handle it. We are logging it to the system exception. So we want to continue the flow run and go to the end of the block. And that is the end of the on-block error. So here I'll click save and I'll take all of these. I can take them one by one, or I can click the first one, hold shift in, click the last one, and then drag them in like this. That means that if I get here, I'll ask, just as before, is the status message empty? In that case, we will log it as a success. So we will find an if and drag it in here. So is the status message, is that empty? Like this. Then we will log the success. Let me save it and let's try to run it again. Right now, yeah, we will be getting only system exceptions, and you can discuss if we want to also make a check that terminates our flow, or probably maybe retry this so that we try to open this page like 3 times. If we don't succeed, then we're not going to do it. So right now we are trying to perform it. I'll just fast forward until the end, and then we will inspect the Excel. That's it. I didn't have to fast forward at all. We have ran it. Let's see our flow in action. So I open up the new one here, and if I double click here, we can see that we're now having a business exception 5 times, and that is, let me show you what I did wrong here. I open up the system exception, and here I will have the system exception. I choose to include these in my videos because, as you can see, I always also make mistakes. I'm just a human like you. Don't knock yourself when you do these. I will of course update the video, and let me just show you that this works. So I will run it again, and if we run inside from a subflow, it will still run a main. I'll fast forward to this has ran, and we will see the actual actions. That's it. And you will see that if I go into the next Excel book, now we have the system exception, and we're separating because first we do the business exception check here, and then we do the system exception, saying that we cannot populate the student input field. Now we can handle 2 different kinds of exceptions. We have the student, we have the business exception and the system exception. While this Excel thing is a great way to do simple logging, you can easily lose structure, especially if you want to add more features to the log, such as a date. So let's create an advanced log that will not lie in Excel. I'll close this one here, and I'll go to my File Explorer. Let me open up a new tab. Let's go to Documents. Here I'll create a log folder. Feel free to place your log folder wherever you want. So I'll right click here, I'll say new folder. Let's call it Power Automate Desktop Logs. Do not delete. This is important, otherwise sometimes they're getting easily deleted. And let me also fix this E here. Like this. Then we will shift right click, copy as path. So we're copying the path for this on my machine. Then I'll go in here. Let's design our log. Go say write, new, and then a text document. This one we will give the same name as our workflow. In our case, let's just remind ourselves, we called it best practices demo. So I go up here and then I'll say best practices demo. In case you don't see this extension .txt, then what you're going to do is to go up to View, Show, File Name Extensions. Right now they are not there. Otherwise we are like this. In case you have Windows 10, you also just need to go up to your menu, click View, and then File Name Extensions. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to change this extension txt in a little while. Let's first open it. It's a bit more easy to work. So what do we need in our log? We will need a start time. We will also need a workflow, so we comma separate them. We will have a subflow. Is it our main that we are in? Is it our process transaction? Where are we? We also want to say in which action are we using it, and then we want the comment. This is a great log template that I learned from a very sharp Power Automate person called Shaky. His channel is right up here in the right corner. Please give him a subscribe, but come back to this video. So right now we have a log. I can close and save it. Then we want to change this extension. So I go in here and then instead of txt, I will say .csv. Like this, it says, am I sure? Yes. And here you can see that I'm opening it with a weird icon here. That is Notepad++. I'll definitely recommend you to download that now if you don't have it. It's free. It's called Notepad++. There's also a link to that in the description. You can use Excel to open CSV files or even notepads, but we're going to leverage the Notepad++ features. So what you want to do when you have downloaded and installed it, then it's just to right click and then you want to say open with. Make sure you pick the choose another app and then you go find it here. If you don't see your Notepad++, you'll say browse, choose an app on your PC. Like here, go into your program files and then you find a Notepad++ directory. Choose this one here, say open, and that will make it open, and say always. We are always opening CSV files with this Notepad++. Now you can see we have opened it. So we have designed it. We can now start create a log in Power Automate Desktop. So we go back here. First thing, that in the beginning we want to log this workflow name. So that is one thing that you always have to do. Have a set variable in the beginning, call it workflow name, and ours is called best practices demo. In that way we make the connection between this workflow and the log that we want to fill in. So right now we have this workflow name. We also want to store the log directory. We have that in our clipboard. So I'll drag this one in here, and here I'll say log dir. That will be a new variable. Control V. Here you can see we have our log directory in our clipboard. Then I can click save. We can start to log our first, make our first log message. So what do we want to do? I want to say which subflow am I in, at what action am I in, that means the number here, and then a comment. Later on we will add the date and it will look this. So I will have a set variable here, and this one we will call log list. And again, all credit goes to Shaky. I've not to say that I improved it, I make it better to work with this best practice template. And yeah, it's pretty awesome. So thanks again, Shaky. So here we will have the log list, and we're going to create a list here. I'll say main, that will be the subflow that we're using. Then we want to say this one is starting at action 1. Here we want to log that, and we also want to have some sort of a message, also in single quotation mark. And here you can say something like workflow starting. We can even add a name if we wanted. Let's just keep it rather simple. So these are 3 of the things that we want in. So now I want to add the time and the workflow name to it. Let's start by finding the time, and then we will combine this. I'll click save. I scroll down to this for each, then I drag in a set variable in the beginning of each for each. I'll call this time. I'll also make this empty, so it will look like this. And then I'll click save. So we are just resetting a time variable, nothing in it right now. We will start to fill in. Let's create a subflow. So I'll have a new subflow here, and this one will be called current time. Then we can click save. So we already took a date time earlier in the flow, which we used for the Excel file. We will use another date time format for our log. So let's create that. We can combine it. So let's find a get current date time here. We are getting the current date time, and let's just save it to a current date time variable. We will click save. We already have our formatted date time in. Let me show you here. We converted to a formatted date time variable, which we use down here in the close Excel. So if I go in here and then I'll have a convert, I'll find a convert date time to text here. What are we going to convert? That will be the current date time, like this. It will be in a custom format. Now we will have it in a more log friendly format. It will go something like this. And then we'll have the milliseconds. Let's save it into the time variable. So I'll find it here. So now each time we're going to use the time, we will just call this current time subflow and get it there. So we will have a write to log, and that one we will have a here. We'll have a write to log. And what are we going to do here? We're first going to get the current date time. So we have a run subflow, and we'll drag it in here. So we're going to use the current time here. Once we get this, we can merge the two lists, where we can say we want the time and the workflow name in one list, and then we want a list called log list. We created that in the main. We want to merge these two. That will be our log. So find a merge lists here. And the first list, that will be, we will create that manually. That will be the time variable and the workflow name here. And we will have a hard bracket and a percentage sign. The second one, that will be the log list here, like this. And we will just override the log list. So we now have the log list that we want to print to our CSV. So let us click save here. Then we want a write to CSV file, and we will drag that one in here. The variables to write, that will be the log list. And again, please let me know in the video comments below what you think of this. Does this help you? What can I improve? And finally, give it a thumbs up if you like what you see. That definitely helped me and my channel a lot. Thank you. So then we want a file path, and here we have our log dir. So let's scroll up to find that. We want to say the log dir. Then we have the variable called workflow name. That's why we call it the same name as the workflow. then we say .csv. We also want to go to advanced, and here what we want to do is to append the content, since we're going to add this data over and over. And let me just scroll a little bit down here. We also want to separate it by a comma, and let's just make sure that we do that. So we say our CSV is separated by a comma. That's it. Now we are writing the log here over and over each time we do it. We only called it once, that is up here, but we will apply it to our flow later on. So right now we're going to say we want to, after we have this set variable called log list, we want a run subflow here. And here we want to run the subflow, write to log, and then we want to click save. Right now we're only going to make one log entry, so we can choose to stop our workflow after that. We can use a breakpoint. Click here, you can see that it turns red. That means that our workflow will stop once it gets here, but it's plenty of time to have the log written, and that's just what we want to check now. So right now we should have written in the log. It will only say the time, the best practices demo, main one, and the workflow starting. If I go in here to the best practices demo, you can see that we have just that here. We have a time, we have a workflow name, we have the subflow, we have an action and a comment. That's it. Now, each time our flow runs, we will append the content here. So pretty handy, isn't it? Now we can just stop the flow and we can add further log entries so we can see that this also works. So right now, let me go up here. What we need to write to a log is this set variable log list and then this run subflow called write to log. So click this set variable, hold control in and click this one, say Control C. Now I have what I need in my clipboard. Let's go down here. So in this for each, I also want to do a log that is for each one of these students. I'll say new student processing. So I'll click this set variable, Control V, and now I pasted in what I need. I just need to change this log list. So I double click here. And here I'll say I'm still in the main, and each student is starting at number 19. That is indeed the log. You can also argue it should be 21, up to you. And here we will say new student processing. Like this. So now we have one log entry. We also want to have, for example, we can say right here, we can also say we want the student, we want the result in the log. So here I press Control V, and move the Excel one up above. And then I'm just going to open this one here. And here I will change 1 to, that will be 29 here. And then I will have a log message saying something like student processed with the result. And let's just have a colon and a space, and let's combine it with the actual result. So I will, let's just have a space and then say status. That will be my status variable where I have logged in the actual result. So right now we also have this in the log, and let's go down here to the end, Control V. Again, we are in the main. We can choose to have these logs in our subflows. We don't do it for now, but feel free to do it. It will work just as the same. Just copy these ones in here. So here we're saying in the 14th, we will say workflow ending like this, and we'll click save. Well, let's save it. And before we actually try to run it, the clever thing about using the Notepad++ for these logs or any other log program with live logging. That is, it doesn't log this file once our flow runs. And that means that we can easily do live logging. We can inspect it to see if everything is going on. Is there errors in the flow? All these things. So once maybe I can do this, I can click run. And then, yeah, of course, we have 2 business exceptions again, and we will have 3 system exceptions where we are we cannot find these input fields. Feel free to change the URL to the original one. That will also work there. So right now we have created an awesome log, and more importantly, we have also encountered for a lot of exceptions. We have documented everything. Keep in mind that your flows will be slower now, because the more actions you add to your flows, the slower they will get. Not a problem. You should always do exception handling, logging if that is needed. And if we go again to our log here, the best practices demo, you can even see that right now we have added the new things. If you want to live view this, because Notepad++ lets you view this in real time, you simply just go to View, Monitoring Tail F, and that way we can do live log viewing here in Notepad++. Let's now do some input validation. That means that we want to check if our robot write something. We want to check if that is what we told the robot to write. In a lot of cases, if you have an unstable system, you might see that some letters are missing, and we want to check for that. And then if it's not the case, that if it's not written the result that we want, then we want to retry X times. So let me close down the log, and we will go to our browser. Go back to the original one here. We will take this URL. I will copy it over. Let's go to Power Automate Desktop, and let's create a new flow which we called Input Validation Playground. I like to have these ones here because then we don't need to change our entire main flow that we built so far. It's been a long day. So here, the Input Validation Playground, I've now have an empty one. Let's just say that we want to check if we're going to write the correct student ID. So let's have a static student ID. Student ID here, and here I'll just say AC789. That will be our static student ID. Then, and these errors come and goes. That's not a problem that you have made. Just click close. Power Automate Desktop will continue. That is some of the things that we see as Power Automate developers. I'll then drag in a launch new Microsoft Edge. And here we want to grab the initial URL, which was up here. So make sure you copy that one here and paste it in here. So we want to run a loop that go over and over, and if we and then we try to populate the student ID, and we want to extract it. Then we want to compare these two, and then we are done if that is correct. If they are different, we want to run it over and over. Let's do one by one. So here I want a loop condition. Let's just have it go over and over. That means that this one here will just run, because true is always equal to. This will be an infinite loop, and I can run it and test it, or you can do it. But we will of course change this. Never make an unlimited loop. So the first thing we want to do here in our loop, that is to populate the text field with the student ID. So here I'll say populate text field on web page. I'll create the student ID here. And what do I fill in? I fill in the student ID variable that we just created up here. I'll click save. Let's also, because we don't want to forget these things, I want to rename this just as we did before. I know we did it, but always make it a good practice to rename your UI elements and variables like this. So right now we are populating it. We can also extract it to make sure that, because we're populating it here, then we want to extract whatever number or letter that might be in here. So find and extract data from web page and make it in here. For this to work, we just need to have our web page to open, then this live web helper will occur. Go in here inside the student ID, right click, extract element value, and pick this 2343, click the text. We have chosen it and I'll click finish. We're saving it in a data from web page variable. I'll click save. Because this one will of course run as long as these two are equal to each other. Let's have a breakpoint here in the end, just to inspect that we can input the student ID and we can extract it here in the data from web page, and then we know how we can work with the data from web page. Here we open up a new browser. We're inputting the student ID, we're extracting the data, and now we pause the robot. We can go over here, click stop, remove the breakpoint for now, go into the data from web page, and here you have it. So now we have extracted whatever is in the field, and now we can start comparing it. But keep in mind that this is a data table. That means that to get in here, we need to have the first row, that is the 0th row, index 0, and the first column, that is index 0. So 0.0 in data table terms, because it's 0 indexed. We will click close here. So right after the extract data from web page, we will have a set variable here. And here we will have the extracted student ID like this. What do we write here? We want to look in the data from web page. Then we want to go into the first column. So I'll say 0. And the first row, that is 0, and the first column, that is also 0, so 0.0. The rows is first and then the columns. Then I can click save. So now we can correct the loop condition, because we want this flow to run as long as the student ID is different from the extracted student ID. That means that we try over and over. I go up here, double click here. And then we're going to say, we want to look at the student ID. If that is not equal to the extracted student ID, so I delete this extracted student ID. And then we can click save here. Now to see this works, to see that, let's mimic some errors. So before the extract and after the populate, I'll add another breakpoint. Let's try to run it. And right now we are run it. We populate the student ID, and then in 2 seconds when we click continue, our workflow will check, is this the correct student ID? But let's add a number. Just that could be an error. We can also delete it if you prefer like this. Then we'll click run. And now we're continuing because the student ID is not correct. Let's make another error. Click run. We will check, and it will run over and over until it is getting correct. Of course, we want some sort of a maximum. Let's just try to click run now. Now it will check and it will find out, well, this is the correct student ID that's written in that we asked the robot to. We can now stop. Let's move the breakpoint. So we saw this work, but we also want a max loop counter because it's not ideal to have this stuck. Let's say that it's an unstable system. Our workflow will be stuck here forever or for a long, long time. So let's have a set variable before the loop condition. This will keep track of where we are in the loop. I'll call this loop index. Let's have it the value 1, and then we will add 1 to it for each one of these iterations. So go down here, and then you'll say you can also pick it from the variable picker, which I told you that we should always do. So let's do that. And then we'll do it here. The only times I don't do it, I shouldn't do it, that is probably sometimes when you make a larger code block and you need a variable in there, because then you also need to delete the percentage sign. So that will be another source of error. You might not want to do that there. So now we have this loop index one by one. Let's say that we only want to try 3 times, and then we want to have a system exception. So what I do here is that I double click up here. So I will do this first one to say student ID. I will gather it on one line. I'll say student ID. It's different from the Excel. And here's what I said. Then I need to delete this. So first I'm just rewriting this whole thing. And this the operator equal. So now I'm asking, is the student ID different from the extracted student ID? If that is true, then we'll run our loop. That is the exact same thing as we wrote before. I did this because now I can combine, I can look at the loop index, because I also want to say and. I like to keep these in capitals, then we can see that this is an operator. Then I'll say and here I'll say loop index is less than or equal to 3. Both of these needs to be true, and then if that is true, we will run this over and over. Again, we can try to have this, to check this, to have a breakpoint here, run it, and now we are populating it. Let's do, just to see that this works, 3 times, 3 arrows. And then we should finish, because the loop index will be 4. Yep, that's it. So this works. We will of course try to throw an arrow where we will say if we have tried 3 times, then we want to throw the arrow saying that we cannot type it in. Let's implement this input validation playground, and then we will do it in our main. So click this set variable up here, hold shift in, click it down here, Control C. We will be using this in our process transaction subflow of our main. So let's go back to the main. I'll go back to the main here, and we need to go into the process transaction. So right after we have tried to populate this student in, we want to have a region where we check for the student ID. This is a practice that I will use a lot. Check that whatever we told the workflow to write in, is that also what it did write in. I'll have a region here, and here we can call this check student ID, and we will click save. So unfortunately we cannot manually throw an arrow. So what we instead can do is to have a label, and in the end of our block arrow here, we will have a label, and that's it. If this doesn't work, we want our flow to jump here, and here we'll just say end of on block arrow, like this. So now we will inside this region we will have our check, Control V. We just built that. So here we will check if everything is correct with the student ID. So in the end of this check student ID, we will ask, is the loop index equal to 4? That means that we have tried this 3 times. It didn't work. And then we can say, we can log a status message, and we can go to this label down here. So in the end of the check student ID, have an if. Sometimes Power Automate Desktop hides these ifs. It'll be up here. Just expand this. There's not a system in it, so yeah. So make sure that it's between this blue, green, and yellow. And here we will ask, is the loop index, so yeah, is the loop index equal to 4? If yes, then we will set a status message and say that we couldn't type the student ID correctly. So what we do here is that we will have a set variable like this, have it in here, and here we set the status message. So status message, and we will say couldn't type student ID correctly, something like that. We'll have it here, and after that we will go to this label down here. So what we will do here is to have a go to right here and drag it in here, and that will be the end of the unblock error. I can click save. And to make sure that this status message gets logged as a system exception, that will be here, then we will run the subflow system exception. So here you will find a run subflow, drag it in here, and choose the system exception because that's what it is. I'll click save here. We will not test this, but this will work. You're more than welcome to do so. Add in a breakpoint and do these waits. Let's talk about waits, because let me show you here in our here we have I've created another web page with a delay. That means that each time I run this, you will see that this form has a built-in delay of 6 to 12 seconds. That could be a buggy or slow web page rather. Here we go, we have it, and we need to account for that. We will create a playground once more. Well, let me grab this, and we will create another playground. So I'll say wait playground and open it. Now we will again navigate to this. So let us just have a launch new Microsoft Edge and paste in this. That will open up a browser. Then we want to populate a text field. So that's what we do in the main. So I'll have a populate text field on web page. Choose to add a UI element. And this is the one with the delay. That one will be here. And let's just pick a random student name, a student ID like this. So now let's say that I run this. You will see that it will take 6 to 12 seconds to type in the student ID, and our flow says, well, we already typed in. For some reason it sent it this student ID here, but it will not be typed in here. And that is really not nice, because in that way we are not waiting for this form to load. What we could do, the simple solution, would be to add a wait here, have a 12-second wait before we populate anything. Let me try to run it again. So now we're waiting 12 seconds. You and I are together for 12 seconds. And in that time, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel yet, please do so. I'll be making a lot more advanced Power Automate desktop videos. Here we go, we had the wait. But instead of a static wait, we can use a wait for web page content. That is more efficient. Imagine that we have 1,000 or 10,000 students, and instead of waiting 12 seconds, we can say wait just as long as this form has to load, for example 8 seconds in average. That will save us around 12 hours. We also have flexibility, because we can set up specific events or triggers to happen before we start to fill in. It will be more robust, because sometimes these 12 seconds might not be enough. And here we are making just say wait for this and then continue. It's also nice to do error handling with this, because it will get a lot easier. So what we do instead of this wait, we will delete it. Find a wait for web page content and drag it in here. We want to wait for the web page to contain an element. What element is that? So I'll add the UI element. Pick the entire form here, control, and pick it, click save. Here we have the form student ID, first name, last name, add student. That is fine. Now we can try to run it. And what you see here is that we will wait to continue until this form has loaded. Once that is loaded, then we will continue the flow and populate the student ID. Here you go. This will be the correct way to do it. We can also, let me open here, open up the wait for web page content. We can fail with a timeout error. We can say, I want to fail this one, look for it for X seconds, for example, 1 second, and now it will fail. And then we can handle that error. So right now you can see that we wait for 1 second, and then we're throwing an error here. It says timeout has expired. We can even account for that as well. Let's go in here. And we can either choose to not fail with the timeout error. Here we could get stuck if the element that we want to check for is not loading. So probably you want to do like, I don't know, 100 or something, and then it will time out, and you should handle that error as well. So let's just pick 100. We will click save here. So copy the wait for web page content and the populate text field on web page, press Ctrl and click both of them, then Ctrl C. Go back to your best practices demo. So what we want to do here in the process transaction in the beginning, so before we do anything else, and that is before we populate this, we want to make sure that this form is there. So here I will Ctrl V, paste it in. Now we can open up the wait for web page content because we can have a timeout error here. And what will that look like? And that will look like we have this on error. And so we will just set a return error that will be caught by this unblock error we created earlier. And then we will say the input couldn't load. So here we'll have a set variable. We will have the status message. Either do this or again, let's practice it so we always use the variable picker. So here we will say input couldn't load. We'll throw the error that will be caught here. So that means that we will go to the end and continue. So right now we have implemented the dynamic wait over static waits as well. Work queues in RPA acts as a centralized storage for tasks, ensuring efficient workload balancing. We can easily monitor tasks. We can make sure they comply with our SLA. We can prioritize. We can do everything. What we want to do is to split our flows into two, a dispatcher and a performer. Let me explain you what this is. To take our current flow, we want one flow that is the dispatcher that will be to say, what data do we need to work with? Here's in an Excel sheet. So we will take this Excel data and add them to a queue one by one. So each student here is a transaction item. Then we will have a performer. That will be where we take each one of these items in the queue one by one and then perform them. By doing this, it allows us to spread these transaction items across multiple bots that can run concurrently. Or we can prioritize things, and in the end, we can easily watch what is going on. Let's try to do so. So what I want to do, and maybe we should clean a little bit up here in all our browsers, so I'll do so. Every link is in the description below. So now I only have this. We go to powerautomate.com, and what you need to find is the monitor, then the work queues down here. Here we're going to make a new work queue. So you say new, we give our work queue a name. I will call mine students, and then we'll click create. So this is the queue that we're going to use for our workflow with the students. Let's add a few manually. After that, we will of course use our Excel sheet to add the students to the queue. So I'll say new. Now we'll add a queue item. We can give it a name that is a describing name that we want the queue item to have. It's nice because then we can easily track them. Let's say I want something like this. And then I want this comma separated queue item data. So that will be, in our case here, it could look like this. We want it comma separate because then our Power Automate desktop robot can easily split this. So I do this, create, and now we have a queue item. If I say see all, you can see this queue item. We have a name and we have a value. What I want to do is to, of course, process it with our flow. That will be our performer. And then we want to change the queue status and have some processing nodes. Let's go create that. We need the work queue ID, and that is this one you see up here. So Control C, copy everything from this A to F. You probably have another number, so go do that and go to the best practices. In the beginning, we go to main, up to this set variable, we will have another set variable. So here, let's just have it in the end of these 4. And this one we will call work queue ID. I'll go into the value, Control V to paste it in. So then we go down. Instead of a for each, we will have a process work queue items. So I will find a process work queue items. It serves almost as a for each, but here we just take one item from the queue at a time. So drag it in before the for each for now. The work queue, we created a variable for that. That one was called work queue. And here we can see we produce a variable. So each time we take a queue item, it's called work queue item. I'll click save. And then we want the end to be right here. So what we can do, that is this end, what we can do is simply just click this for each, delete this. And then since we're going to use the other end, we can just delete this end here. And now we have a nice process work queue items. We still need to fix both the student ID, the first name and the last name coming before from the data table. Now it comes from our queue. So now we need to split this work queue item because this work queue item comes in with this value. So we need to take the value out of the work queue item and say index 0, that will be the student ID, 1, the first name, and 2, the last name. So let me go here. And then we will find a split. We'll drag it in here. What text do we need to split? That will be the work queue item, but click this arrow and choose the value. The delimiter type, that will be comma. So we will choose custom and a comma. And here we will say work queue item and value like this. Then we'll click save. Now we just need to go to the student ID, first name and last name. And instead of this, we will have the work queue item value. Here it will be 0. That was the first value. Let me copy this. So I click save here. Go to process transaction. The first name, that will be index 1. And the second name, that will be index 2, like this. So now we need to update the actual work queue items. So we will say either it's a success or an exception. Because we cannot use variables inside the update work queue item, we will make an if, just asking, is this a success or not, right before the write to Excel worksheet. So what I do here is that I want to say, is the status equal to success? Yes or not? If yes, then we want to update the work queue item as a success, else we want to do an exception. So find an else up here and drag it in here. So up in actions, you will find an update work queue item, drag it in here. So now we know it's a success. We will update it as processed. and here we will give in the status like this, click save. Similarly, we will do that in the else. So I will Control C, copy this, go down to the end, Control V, double click to open it, and instead of a processed, we will have a generic exception. I'll click save. Now we can delete all the Excel activities. So I can have this write to Excel worksheet, delete that. I don't want to write it to Excel anymore. I want to use my queue. Delete this, close Excel. Up in the beginning, I will delete the read, I'll delete the set active, I'll delete the launch, and I can delete the set variable active Excel sheet. Let's try to run it. Right now, we're still having the flow with the system exception. Now we're opening up, it's still a system exception, but that's fine. We will see that our queue is able to handle our system exception and categorize it as an exception with their exception message. So let me go to my browser. You need to refresh the queue here. And here you can see it says exception, and it says a system exception that it couldn't populate the student input field. That is great. We can now use our queue. But yes, it will get a little tired if we need to manually add these to the queue. Imagine that we have 1,000 transactions. So let's see how we can do that. First, let's add the initial URL. I'll grab that. That is the first one we created. It's just a little bit more fun to see that that works. So I go up here in the set variable URL, paste in that, then click save. So now we want to make sure that everything works, and we want to make sure that everything works where we add the entire Excel book sheet to our work queue. So let's do this first. First, we need to move we can do this in several ways. Here we have our project folder. I have my input here. Let's copy that one out here. I go to my OneDrive. This could also be SharePoint or whatever Cloudflow you have, such as Dropbox. I'll right click here and I'll say new folder, and let's call this best practices demo. You could of course add another folder when you go into production with this. And then I move in here and I'll paste in this Excel. And what we need to make sure is that it's uploaded to OneDrive as it has now. And then we go to our Power Automate Cloud. We need to open up another instance of Power Automate Cloud. I can just right click here and duplicate tab. Here we want to create a flow. So when you are here at the home, click create. We can choose to automate this, say that we want to add items from folder each morning or each time we get an email, we can do that. Let's just pick an instant Cloudflow for now. Here we can call this dispatcher. We will manually trigger our flow and then we will click create. The first thing we need to do is to get the students out of the Excel, and then we will add them to a queue, which is our queue. So here you will find a list rows present in a table. The location, that will be OneDrive. OneDrive file, that will be, I'll find a best practices demo. Here I will find the students, and the table, you can see here it's called students 100, table 2, table 26. And that is because, let me show you, if I open this one here, if I need to find out which one we're going to use, that is the students exceptions, I can go in here, take the table design, it's called table 26. You can of course rename it if you want. Let's just stick with that for now. So we go here and we pick the table 26. I'll click save. So now we have each one of these rows. We will iterate through them. I'll pick a new step and then I'll find and apply to each. Yep. We will take the value from up here and then we will add each one of these rows to our queue. I'll take a new step and then we will have an add a new row. Pick the one that's called Microsoft Dataverse like this, and we need to put it inside here. So let me drag it up here. It needs to be inside the apply to each. The table name, that will be work queue items. So find it here. The name of the work queue item, well, that will be, we created an ID for that in the list rows present in the table. So let's pick the student ID. We did that as well before. Then we need a work queue ID, like here. What you do here is to have a /, say work queues. Then you want a parentheses start. We need to grab the work queue ID. So let's move back to the queue. Control C, copy this one in, go back to the second one here, and in the parentheses. Then we also need to say what data do we need to input. So here in the input, well, we set the student ID, we set the comma, first name, and we say the last name like this. We can also have a status reason. That is, we want to say these ones are queued. So let's click save here. So what we're doing here with this Cloudflow is that we're reading from an Excel sheet and then we add them to a queue, which in our case is the student queue. Let's try to manually test it. And here we would have 5 different students added to the queue in a few seconds. So this is the way to do it if you want to scale it. Let's go here. Let me refresh it here. And here you can see that we have added these ones to the queue. Since this Daniel Chen missed a student ID, you can see that this one gets a longer one. That will just be the work queue item. That is fine for now. And even this one here, that was our exception from the beginning. So now when our workflow processes these ones here, it will handle it with each one of the different exceptions tied to it. Right now we will have the business exceptions and those ones will be locked. So let's try to run it once more. Now we will loop through 5 of these. So let's see how that works. Here's our first queue item. That one looks fine. And you'll see that now we might do a check if this was an exception. So we might have done the check. It will take a little bit longer, but it will hopefully get updated in the queue. It will. We just saw it worked. And we will have 3 or 4 successes. And then our web browser will close, like here. Let's go to our queue. That one was here. If I refresh this, you can see that we now have 3 processed. We have an exception here. That is student ID is blank. That's right. We also have this student ID is not in the correct format. That's also right. What is nice with this work queues is that we can come back to here, say that our workflow has ran. Then we can easily come back here and inspect what has going on with the different queue items. For example, this one here. We can inspect what is wrong with the Peter Leo. So, and we can even choose to retry if we want that, build that in our flow. But let's not overcomplicate things. What you need to understand here is the benefit of a queue. That is that we can now monitor everything well. We can prioritize these queue items. So say that some are more important than others, then we can do that. Every automation should be built with a config. The benefit here is that we can easily update the parameters. In our case, those were the set variables in the beginning, and also that a business person can easily update these values. Say that he or she wants to change something in our workflow. I don't really want to share the code because that way he or she can make errors, not intentionally, but just because he's not that experienced compared to me or another advanced developer. Not to say that we are more worth as an experienced developer, we just have different competences, so we'll make a config. Let's do so by going to our documents. We had this Power Automate desktop logs, do not delete. So let's create a similar one. I'll call this Power Automate desktop config. Do not delete, like this. So let's open it, double click it, and right click new Microsoft Excel worksheet. Here we will call this one best practices demo, the same as our workflow. Double click to open it. We will have one sheet here, rename that, so right click, call this one constants, like here. We will make two different columns. The first one will be key and the second one will be value. Those ones equal to our set variables in the beginning of our workflows. See the variable name as a key and then the variable value as the value. So what do we need here? Well, we need the log dir and we need the URL, and let's inspect what else we're going to need. Go to the main, go up here. So here we are going to pick in the log dir here. We also need the project path, but since we're not going to use it anymore, we used it with Excel, we can also delete it. Only keep it if you want to update the Excel as well. Then we need the URL and the work queue ID. Let's start by this log dir. So I'll just copy this one here, move back here, paste it in here. The URL, I have it here. Control C. I will have it here, and we also have the work queue ID. The order is not important. The work queue ID, we also had that one in here. But now what we want to accomplish is that we don't need to have the workflow open. Say it's either in a different machine or not the user. Then we can just use these values here for our config. So we have these three ones here. I'll save it. So now they are named the same one. And the intuition here is that we want to read it as an Excel. Then we want to convert it into a custom object, which is key value pairs, and then we can refer to those ones by their keys and get their values out. Let me show you how that works. The first one here, let's just get the config folder. So I shift right click, copy as path, I move back here. We need another subflow, and that one is called new subflow here, and we will call this one config here. We will have a config path. I recommend to always stick with the same, otherwise we can of course change it here. Like this. I'll delete this one and this one. Can also, if you're going to change these places, I rather prefer to have it in our main in the beginning. It doesn't matter, variables are used across subflows. So now we have this one here. And then we need a VBScript. And the first one I'll say VBScript. VB is just a script that will run, and then it can do some more advanced things that we can do in Power Automate Desktop. Now we need a VBScript. I'll also link to that in the description below. That will take you to my Google Drive. What we need is this script in here. I can inspect it here. It's simply just a script that opens up in Excel. It takes the config path, that was the variable that we just created. It also used the workflow name that we created. It reads the constants sheet. Then it takes, do a little bit of data manipulation, and it create a custom object, or it create a JSON, which we can convert into a custom object. So copy this run VB script here, paste it in here like this. Instead of the actual VB script output, let's rename this to config as JSON here, and we'll click save. So what we also need is to convert this to a custom object. So find a convert. And here you'll say convert JSON to custom object. We use a custom object because it's easy to refer to that within Power Automate Desktop. So the JSON, that will be this one, the config as JSON up here. And here we will say config as JSON object. That describes it a little bit better. So we'll click save here. Then we can also go, we should go into the main. So here, I'll click the main. So we're going to use the config right before this log dir. So what you just do here is to say the run subflow, have it here, and that one was the config, like this. We can try to run it, so set in a breakpoint here at the log dir. Make sure you close the Excel, try to click run. It will be rather quickly to initialize this. And what you can do here is to go over to your config as custom object, open it, and here you can see that we now can refer to this config as custom object, give the key, which is logdir URL or workQID, and then we will have a value back. So let's do that. So right now we're using a config instead of these set variables, or we will do so. Let's have this breakpoint removed. So what we're not going to use, that is this set variable log dir. Delete that, and that will give an error. That's fine. You can see the error is over here in the right to log. We can also delete this URL and the workQID. Don't worry, we will fix these. So what we will do here is that in this launch new Microsoft Edge, I'll double click that. We will use the config as custom object here. And here I will say URL because that's what we called it in our config sheet. And let me just copy this so it's easier to do. Here we will have the workQID. I hope I spell it right, so it will look something like workQID. This key needs to match the one that we did in the Excel sheet. Similarly, the right to log, double click here, and this is the log dir. So delete this and say log dir. We will click save. So now we have created our config. We have nothing in our queue. We can test if it works, but if we want to test that if this works, we can test this dispatcher again. Then we will have new queue items that we can have our flow to run with. So right now we're adding this. This will be added to our queue. Then when we start our flow, we have data to process, and we can see that it works. If I refresh this, we can see we have 5 new queue items. Well, they are the same as this one, but still 5 new that we can process. Let's try to run the best practices demo again. We are getting quite advanced. We have now built a config, and again, please do it in all your workflows where you have input data, especially if you want to change these, if you want to update, if you want to share them across departments. It's very easy to have a centralized place in OneDrive or SharePoint where a business person can update these things. That could be a URL or an email address for the log, max retry attempts, everything we need there. So that's it. And yeah, you saw everything work, and you can see everything work if I refresh here. Now we have 2 exceptions and 3 processed again. That's how easy it is to use a config. We can go even more advanced here. That is, instead of each time we need to copy this code in for a config, I will just have a new workflow where we build a config. I'll call that workflow every time my workflow runs, those that needs a config. So let us go to Power Automate, have a new flow. This will not be a playground. This will be the actual build config that I will use in all my workflows. So I will maximize this here. So what we just need to do is to go down to Best Practices Demo, find the config here, Control C, copy this one, go down to build the config here. Now you see that our workflow name doesn't exist. That is the one that we use in the VBScript. If I open here, you can see that one is up here, and that is because we haven't initialized it yet. And also here, this config path, all my configs are here. That is a nice way to have a centralized place. In case we also want these to change, this variable should lie in our main workflow. Let's just not overcomplicate things. So I want to call this config workflow each time I want to build a config. That means that I want to have an input variable. I'll call this workflow name. That'll be at the kind text. Let me copy this because I also want it to be named externally. So that one will come in, and then this config as custom object will go out. I'll have an output. And right now, since this exists, we will be getting a warning saying, do we want to merge these two? That will be fine. Copy this. And this one, since this is a custom object, pick a custom object down here and click save. And yeah, that was the merge thing here. Click it. Though this flow, we will just call this from our main, and then that will work. So I will click save here. And what we do here is that we can close the build config. We can go over here. Now we can delete this config flow. I'll delete this one here. And right now you can see that we have some errors because we cannot find the config as custom object, and there's a subflow we cannot find. That's fine. So first one, we don't need to run a subflow anymore. We will run a desktop flow. So I will delete this run subflow. Then I'll have the run desktop flow, and I'll drag it in here. So I will run the desktop flow called build config. That is the one that we just created. I'll pick that one. The workflow name, well, we have a variable for this. So that one will just be this. And here you can see we produce a variable called config as custom object. I'll click save. All our errors disappear. So very, very, very nice. And what we just also want to do here is that we can test it, but I promise you it works. If you want to test it, run the dispatcher one more time and then test it. Last thing is to go over to these ones here. We have some duplicates here, some UI elements that we don't use. What you can do here is to click these three dots, remove unused elements, click delete, and then we only have the elements that we're using in the actual flow. Your next lesson is here. Want to learn more advanced Power Automate desktop? Then you should join the I Love Automation Discord community. We are more than 8,000 RPA developers networking and helping each other. It's free, and your invitation and guide is right here.